I'm Daniela Harrison, 35, with a Harvard MBA that gathers dust while I run HR at Pinnacle Industries. Most executives see me as just the people person despite my finance background. Yesterday, VP Jeremy Williams introduced me to our biggest potential client as still just in HR, with a condescending snicker. Today, our CEO needs someone to save a $302 million contract. Tomorrow, I'll walk into that boardroom as the new CFO, and Jeremy's face will be worth every moment I've been underestimated. Before I tell you how I turn the tables on the most arrogant executive in our company, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever been underestimated at work and want to see how the corporate chess game is really played. My journey to Pinnacle Industries wasn't the traditional HR path. After graduating from Harvard Business School, with a focus on corporate finance and organizational psychology, I spent 5 years at Goldman Sachs, then another 3 at McKinsey. My colleagues were surprised when I pivoted to human resources, but I had my reasons. I'd seen how toxic leadership could destroy even the most profitable companies from within. I wanted to build workplace cultures where talent thrived, rather than simply helping the wealthy become wealthier. Pinnacle Industries seemed perfect on paper. A tech manufacturing company valued at $11 billion with cutting-edge products and a reputation for innovation. Their glossy recruiting materials showcased diverse teams' competitive benefits and a supposed commitment to work-life balance. The reality inside those gleaming glass headquarters told a different story. From my first week as Executive Director of Human Resources, I noticed the disconnect between executive leadership and everyone else. The C-suite occupied the top floor of our Seattle headquarters, rarely venturing down to the other 4 floors, where actual work happened. Employee satisfaction surveys revealed alarming patterns: high turnover in key departments, complaints about communication, and widespread frustration with decision-making processes. At the center of these issues stood Jeremy Williams, Vice President of Operations. Tall, perpetually tan, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and custom Italian suits, Jeremy looked every inch the corporate success story. Yale undergraduate, Wharton MBA, and 20 years climbing corporate ladders by stepping on others' fingers. He commanded the largest department budget and never let anyone forget it. "Daniela, darling," he would say in meetings, "while I appreciate HR's input, we're discussing actual business metrics here." The subtle emphasis on actual never escaped me or the other executives, who would shift uncomfortably but never contradict him. In stark contrast stood our CEO, Margaret Palmer, a self-made tech pioneer who had founded Pinnacle 20 years ago. Margaret possessed both brilliance and genuine concern for the company's people. She had recruited me personally, recognizing the need for transformation in company culture. "We've grown too fast," she confided during my interview. "I need someone who understands both the human and financial sides of this business to help realign our values." Though she wielded ultimate authority, Margaret was often pulled in too many directions to counter Jeremy's day-to-day influence. My closest ally quickly became Allison Taylor, my executive assistant who had worked at Pinnacle for 7 years. With her encyclopedic knowledge of company history and razor-sharp observation skills, Allison provided insights I couldn't have gained otherwise. "Jeremy wasn't always this bad," she explained during my first month. "His department delivered consistently until about 2 years ago. Since then, he's become increasingly territorial and secretive, especially about operational expenses." Frank Chen, our Chief Technology Officer, represented another challenge. Brilliant but conflict-averse, Frank had aligned himself with Jeremy, creating a powerful voting bloc in executive decisions. Their departments controlled 70% of company resources, which they protected fiercely. Rounding out our executive team was Richard Cooper, our Chief Financial Officer. At 63, Richard had announced his plans to retire within the year. Respected for his integrity and institutional knowledge, he rarely challenged Jeremy directly, but would occasionally raise an eyebrow at particularly dubious financial projections. My daily reality involved navigating this complex landscape while trying to implement meaningful changes for our 5,000 employees. I created leadership development programs, revised compensation structures to address inequities, and championed mental health resources. Each initiative required careful positioning to overcome Jeremy's consistent objection: unnecessary expenses that don't impact our bottom line. What Jeremy didn't know was that I reviewed every departmental budget as part of my comprehensive approach to organizational health. 6 months into my role, I began noticing peculiar patterns in operations financial reporting: inconsistent vendor costs, fluctuating headcounts that didn't match hiring records, equipment expenses that seemed excessive even for our industry. I started keeping a separate file, cross-referencing these discrepancies against company performance metrics. The patterns suggested potential financial manipulation, but I needed more concrete evidence before approaching Margaret. Meanwhile, I continued performing my HR duties while being systematically undermined by the man who might be compromising our company's financial integrity. The stage was set for a confrontation I never anticipated would change both our trajectories at Pinnacle Industries. The Westbrook Innovations meeting had been on our calendar for months. As one of the largest potential clients in Pinnacle's history, their $302 million contract would secure our growth projections for the next 5 years. The preliminary lunch meeting would include Westbrook's CEO, their procurement director, and their technical team, evaluating our manufacturing capabilities. I had spent weeks preparing comprehensive workforce analytics, showing how our employee expertise would ensure quality control throughout their production run. Margaret had specifically requested my presence to address any personnel concerns about handling such a large contract. The restaurant selected for this meeting screamed power lunch, 30-foot ceilings, white tablecloths, and private rooms for discreet business conversations. I arrived 15 minutes early, reviewing my presentation notes while waiting for our team. Jeremy arrived with Margaret and Richard, all in matching dark suits projecting corporate uniformity. Daniela Margaret smiled warmly. "I'm glad you're already here. Thomas Williams from Westbrook specifically mentioned wanting to discuss talent retention strategies." Jeremy's smile tightened imperceptibly, though I'm sure they're more concerned with production capabilities than employee mood surveys. Before I could respond, the Westbrook team arrived. Introductions began professionally enough. Margaret presented each of us with our titles and brief backgrounds. When she reached me, Jeremy interjected. "And this is Daniela Harrison. She's still just in HR," he said with a slight chuckle that implied I held some entry-level position rather than an executive role. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Thomas Williams, Westbrook CEO, who had been making direct eye contact with each person during introductions, merely nodded in my direction before turning his attention back to Jeremy. Their procurement director, Andrea Barnes, who had initially smiled at me now, barely acknowledged my presence. Throughout the appetizer course, I attempted to contribute to the conversation about manufacturing capacity. Our talent retention in specialized engineering roles exceeds industry standard by 23%, which directly impacts production consistency, I offered. Jeremy smiled condescendingly. "What Daniela means is that we keep good people. Now, about our production capabilities." He proceeded to present employee satisfaction metrics I had compiled as though they were his own data. More disturbing, however, were the operational numbers he presented to the Westbrook team. Having reviewed all departmental budgets, I immediately recognized discrepancies between his presentation and our actual financial reports. He claimed manufacturing costs well below what our accounting system showed, promising margins that seemed impossibly optimistic. When the discussion turned to contract specifics, I was effectively excluded. Jeremy positioned himself between me and the Westbrook team, physically cutting me from the conversation. When menus for dessert arrived, Andrea Barnes asked about employee training programs for their specialized products. "I can address that," I began. "I'll handle this one," Jeremy interrupted smoothly. "HR provides basic onboarding, but my team oversees all technical training." This was blatantly false. My department had redesigned all technical training programs 6 months earlier, resulting in a 30% improvement in quality metrics. As the lunch concluded, I watched Jeremy exchange contact information with the Westbrook executives while I gathered my untouched presentation materials. Not a single slide had been shown. Not a single question had been directed to me. 3 hours of professional humiliation while watching someone potentially misrepresent our company's finances. Back at the office, I retreated to my desk, replaying the meeting in my mind. The disrespect was infuriating but secondary to my concerns about Jeremy's numbers. I pulled up our latest financial reports, comparing them to what he had presented. The discrepancies weren't minor rounding errors. They represented millions in unexplained differences. Allison knocked gently on my door, closing it behind her. "That bad?" she asked, noting my expression. "Worse. Jeremy completely sidelined me at the lunch, but that's not what concerns me." I turned my monitor toward her. "Look at these projections he presented versus our actual numbers from last quarter." Allison's eyes widened. "That's not even close to accurate. Is he just being overly optimistic?" "Optimistic is one thing. This looks deliberate." I rubbed my temples, considering my next move. If he makes promises based on these numbers, and we can't deliver, the company's reputation is at stake, not to mention possibly violating financial disclosure laws with a publicly traded partner. "What are you going to do?" "For now, document everything. Tomorrow I'll try to speak with Richard discreetly. As CFO, he should be aware if there's a legitimate explanation." After Allison left, I created a secure folder, documenting the discrepancies, adding it to my growing file of concerns about operations. Something felt very wrong, and the Westbrook contract had just raised the stakes exponentially. For the first time, I wondered if my background in finance might prove more valuable to Pinnacle than my expertise in human resources. The next morning, I arrived at the office an hour early, with a specific mission to speak with Richard Cooper before the day's meetings began. As one of the first executives to arrive and last to leave, our CFO maintained a predictable routine that included reviewing overnight financial reports with a cup of black coffee at 6:30. I found him as expected, reading glasses perched on his nose, surrounded by spreadsheets. "Richard, do you have a few minutes?" I asked, closing his office door. He looked up, mildly surprised. "Daniela, you're here early. Problem with payroll?" "Not payroll. The Westbrook presentation." I placed my laptop on his desk, opening the file containing yesterday's discrepancies. Jeremy presented these operational costs and projections yesterday. They don't match our financial system data. Richard removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The gesture spoke volumes. "You've noticed the pattern, then?" It wasn't a question. "So there is a pattern." I felt a chill despite the confirmation of my suspicions. "How long has this been happening?" "About 18 months. Small discrepancies at first, easily attributed to forecasting optimism. Gradually larger variances, particularly in vendor contracts and operational efficiency metrics." Richard's expression grew troubled. "I've raised concerns with Margaret, but Jeremy always has explanations that satisfy the board. Creative accounting isn't necessarily fraudulent, but it can cross legal and ethical lines," I finished his thought. "Has anyone cross-checked the actual vendor payments against contracted rates?" "That would require a level of audit we haven't initiated. Jeremy manages those relationships directly, claiming it maintains our preferential pricing." The conversation was interrupted by Richard's phone. After a brief exchange, his expression changed. "Margaret wants to see both of us. Now." We found our CEO staring out her office window at the Seattle skyline, the Space Needle barely visible through morning fog. She turned as we entered, her usual composed expression replaced by evident concern. "I just got off the phone with Thomas Williams at Westbrook. They're reconsidering our contract." My stomach dropped. Because of something from yesterday's lunch. Because Jeremy's numbers don't align with their market research on manufacturing costs. They think we're either incompetent or hiding something. Margaret sat heavily in her chair. "The official review meeting is tomorrow. They're bringing their full executive team and financial analysts." Richard cleared his throat. "Margaret, Daniela just showed me some concerning discrepancies in yesterday's presentation." For the next 20 minutes, we laid out the pattern of financial inconsistencies in operations. Margaret listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When we finished, she remained silent for a long moment. Where is Jeremy now? Client meeting in Portland. Returns this evening, Richard answered. Good. We need to talk without him present. She turned to me. Daniela, your background before HR was finance, correct? Yes. Corporate finance at Goldman. Then strategic consulting at McKinsey. Margaret nodded slowly, as though confirming something to herself. We have a serious problem and limited options. Westbrook wants to see completely transparent financials tomorrow. Richard has a family emergency and needs to fly to Chicago this afternoon. Richard looked startled. I do. Yes, Richard, your sister has taken ill. Margaret's pointed look conveyed the fabricated nature of this emergency. You'll need to appoint someone to represent finance in tomorrow's meeting. Understanding dawned on his face. Of course. In my absence, I would typically designate my deputy, but Justin is also out at the Frankfurt conference. I watched this exchange with growing comprehension of their direction. Margaret turned to me. Daniela, your financial background combined with your familiarity with our operations puts you in a unique position. Would you be willing to step in temporarily as acting CFO for this meeting? Despite anticipating this question, hearing it spoken aloud sent a jolt through me. This wasn't just about presenting numbers. This was an opportunity to expose Jeremy's manipulations and potentially save the company from a disastrous contract based on falsehoods. I would need complete access to all financial systems and records effective immediately, I said. Done, Richard responded. I'll have IT update your permissions this morning. And I would present actual numbers, not whatever version Jeremy has prepared. Full transparency with Westbrook. Margaret nodded. That's exactly what's needed. But understand what you're stepping into. Jeremy won't take this well. I'm aware. The magnitude of this confrontation loomed before me. One more condition: I need Allison reassigned to assist me for the next 24 hours. She knows where the bodies are buried, so to speak. Granted. I'll have legal standing by as well. Margaret stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion. I'll announce the temporary changes this afternoon. Richard, prepare the necessary documentation for the transition. As we left Margaret's office, Richard placed a hand on my shoulder. The financial records in the secure server contain everything you'll need. Pay particular attention to the vendor validation reports. That's where I suspect you'll find the largest discrepancies. He paused. Be careful, Daniela. Jeremy has powerful allies on the board. I'm not looking to start a war, Richard. I just want the truth presented. His smile held a mix of concern and approval. Sometimes the truth is the first casualty in corporate warfare. You may not be starting a war, but you're certainly stepping onto the battlefield. By noon, Allison and I had secured a conference room away from main traffic, converted it into a financial war room, and begun the process of reconstructing accurate operational costs. IT had granted my elevated access and financial systems that had previously been viewable, but not navigable, now opened before me. Focus on vendor contracts first, I instructed Allison. Pull everything related to manufacturing components for the Westbrook specifications. As the hours progressed, the evidence mounted. Jeremy had systematically presented optimistic projections as established costs. Vendor discounts, shown as secured, were actually contingent on volume thresholds we hadn't consistently met. Operational efficiencies claimed as standard were actually best-case scenarios achieved only under perfect conditions. Most concerning, several major component suppliers showed two different contracted rates, the official rate in our procurement system and a higher rate that had actually been paid according to accounting records. The difference, millions of dollars annually, had been obscured through a complex allocation system spread across multiple budget categories. This goes beyond creative accounting, Allison whispered, though we were alone in the room. This looks like deliberate misrepresentation. I nodded, capturing screenshots and creating a comprehensive presentation with actual numbers, documentation sources, and realistic projections. The question is why? What does Jeremy gain from making operations look artificially efficient? His bonus structure, Allison replied immediately. 40% of his compensation is tied to operational efficiency metrics, and the board approved his department expansion based on these supposed cost savings. By 7 that evening, we had reconstructed an accurate financial picture of what the Westbrook contract would actually cost Pinnacle. The margins would be tighter than Jeremy had presented, but still profitable, and most importantly, achievable. When Margaret stopped by for an update, her expression grew increasingly grave as I walked her through our findings. This presentation has 2 versions, I explained. The first shows accurate numbers without pointing fingers. The second includes documentation of the systematic discrepancies, if challenged. Margaret nodded slowly. Lead with the first. Have the second ready. She studied me for a moment. Are you prepared for Jeremy's reaction? He won't go down without a fight. I thought about years of being underestimated, of watching less qualified men take credit for women's work, of being introduced as still just in HR, despite my qualifications and contributions. I'm prepared, I assured her, feeling a calm certainty settle over me. Tomorrow we'll let the numbers speak for themselves. After Margaret left our makeshift war room, I sent Allison home to rest before tomorrow's confrontation. Get some sleep. Tomorrow will be intense. What about you? She asked, gathering her things. I need to review the tax implication models and practice the presentation. I managed a tired smile. Plus, I need to figure out what the acting CFO wears to her first executive showdown. Alone in the conference room, surrounded by financial documents, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. The role I was stepping into tomorrow represented both a return to my financial roots and a significant escalation in corporate authority. I had 24 hours to transition from HR executive to CFO, at least in presentation and knowledge. I dove deeper into the financial records, refreshing concepts that had grown dusty since my Goldman days. Tax implications, cash flow projections, capital expenditure allocations. Each topic clicked back into place like muscle memory reawakening. I created additional slides addressing potential questions about manufacturing scale efficiency and component cost volatility. Around midnight, I finally returned to my apartment, mind still racing with numbers and strategies. Sleep would be essential for tomorrow's performance. Yet, as I laid out my clothing options, I realized this wasn't just about being prepared intellectually. The visual transformation would be equally important. In HR, I had deliberately cultivated an approachable image, professional, but warm, with colors and styles that put anxious employees at ease during difficult conversations. Tomorrow required a different Daniela. I selected my most authoritative outfit, a charcoal gray tailored suit, crisp white shirt, minimal jewelry, and the Louboutin heels I reserved for board presentations. The ensemble projected confidence, competence, and unquestionable executive presence. Despite my racing thoughts, exhaustion eventually won. I fell asleep reviewing vendor contract discrepancies in my mind, alarm set for 5 in the morning. The next day dawned gray and rainy, typical Seattle weather that matched the seriousness of what lay ahead. I arrived at the office by 6:30, giving myself time to center my thoughts before the storm. Allison appeared at 7, carrying an extra coffee and a supportive smile. Executive floor is buzzing already, she reported. Margaret announced the temporary leadership change in an email at 5 this morning. Jeremy has been calling board members since 5:15. I took a sip of the much-needed coffee. Anyone we should be particularly concerned about? 2 directors have requested private meetings with Margaret before the Westbrook presentation. Both are Jeremy's golf buddies. Allison hesitated, and Frank Chen wants to see you, said it's urgent. Frank's allegiance to Jeremy made this request concerning. As CTO, his support or opposition could significantly impact today's meeting. Tell him I can give him 15 minutes at 8. The morning accelerated from there. IT arrived to ensure the conference room technology was functioning perfectly. Legal counsel stopped by to review our approach, particularly approving the decision to lead with corrected numbers rather than accusations. Margaret's executive assistant coordinated security details for the Westbrook team's arrival. At 8 sharp, Frank appeared at our door, his usually calm demeanor visibly disturbed. "May I speak with you alone?" he asked, glancing at Allison. "Anything you need to say can be said in front of my assistant," I replied, maintaining eye contact. Frank closed the door. "Jeremy called me at 5:30. He's furious about the temporary appointment and insists the Westbrook numbers require his specific expertise to present properly." "I'm sure he does. Daniela, I've worked with Jeremy for 7 years. He's always delivered results. Results based on accurate numbers, or results based on the numbers he wanted people to see." I turned my laptop toward him, showing a particularly egregious example of manipulated vendor costs. "This isn't about personalities or politics, Frank. These discrepancies could expose Pinnacle to serious liability." Frank studied the screen, his expression shifting from defensive to concerned. "These are the actual payment records, pulled directly from accounting. Compare them to what was presented to the board last quarter." He fell silent, the implications sinking in. Finally, he looked up. "What's your plan for the meeting?" "Present accurate numbers. Set realistic expectations with Westbrook. Secure a contract based on figures we can actually achieve. And Jeremy. We'll have the opportunity to explain the discrepancies to Margaret and the board after the Westbrook situation is resolved." Frank nodded slowly. "He's built powerful alliances. I'm not trying to destroy Jeremy. I'm trying to save this contract and protect Pinnacle from making promises we can't keep." After a moment's consideration, Frank extended his hand. "The technical specifications should align with realistic operational costs. My team is at your disposal today." This unexpected alliance shifted the morning's momentum. By 9:30, we had integrated the technical production requirements with our revised financial projections, creating a presentation that offered Westbrook both transparency and confidence in our capabilities. At 10:15, Allison returned from a reconnaissance mission to the executive floor. Jeremy just arrived. He went straight to Margaret's office. Raised voices heard through the door. I took a deep breath, reviewing our presentation one final time. "What's our room set up for 11? Main conference room is prepared. Westbrook team has cleared security and is in the visitor lounge. 7 executives, including their CFO and general counsel." The gravity of the situation crystallized. This wasn't just about standing up to Jeremy's dismissive treatment. This was about steering a multi-billion-dollar company away from potential disaster, while 7 executives from another corporation evaluated our every word and gesture. At 10:45, I made my final preparations, straightened my suit jacket, applied a fresh coat of neutral lipstick, secured my hair in a precise professional style. The woman in the restroom mirror looked exactly like what she needed to be today, a finance executive capable of handling hundreds of millions of dollars with confidence and transparency. Allison appeared at my side, handing me a tablet with our presentation queued up. "Ready?" I nodded, feeling an unexpected calm settle over me. Jeremy has no idea I've spent 6 months documenting his financial manipulations. He thinks I'm just HR. His mistake, Allison smiled. "Let's go show them what just HR can do." The main conference room at Pinnacle Industries occupied prime real estate on the executive floor corner position with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of downtown Seattle. Inside, our facilities team had arranged the space for maximum impact Pinnacle executives, along one side Westbrook representatives, facing them across the polished mahogany table. Margaret stood at the head of the table, engaged in preliminary conversation with Thomas Williams, Westbrook's CEO. Richard's absence was conspicuous, his usual seat empty beside her. Various executives from both companies exchanged business cards and measured pleasantries, the artificial cordiality of high-stakes business hanging in the air. Jeremy stood near the windows, speaking intensely with Frank. His back was to the door when I entered with Allison, giving me a moment to observe the room dynamics before the confrontation began. The Westbrook team appeared tense, their body language conveying skepticism rather than partnership. Andrea Barnes, Their procurement director, who had dismissed me at lunch, was reviewing documents with a man I recognized from their website as Scott Peterson Westbrook's CFO. Their focus on financial details confirmed my suspicions that Jeremy's numbers had triggered serious concerns. Margaret noticed my arrival first, her expression conveying both relief and apprehension. "Ah, here she is now." She extended her hand toward me, drawing the room's attention. "Everyone please welcome Daniela Harrison, who will be serving as our acting chief financial officer for this presentation." Jeremy spun around, his practiced smile freezing in place. The shock in his eyes lasted only a fraction of a second before he controlled his expression, but it was unmistakable and deeply satisfying. Acting CFO Thomas Williams looked confused. I understood we would be meeting with Richard Cooper. "Unfortunately, Richard had a family emergency," Margaret explained smoothly. "However, we're fortunate that Daniela has extensive financial background from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey before joining our executive team. She spent the night preparing comprehensive financials for our discussion." Scott Peterson from Westbrook studied me with newfound interest. "Goldman and McKinsey. What brought you to Pinnacle's HR department?" Before I could answer, Jeremy interjected, moving toward the seat beside Margaret. "Daniela has indeed been a valuable addition to our HR team. However, given the technical nature of today's discussion, perhaps I should lead the operational cost overview while Daniela provides support on workforce projections." His attempt to reassert control was transparent. So was his shock when Margaret gestured to the seat on her other side. "Daniela will lead our financial presentation today. Jeremy, you'll have opportunity to address specific operational questions as they arise." The subtle power shift reverberated through the room. Jeremy reluctantly took a seat farther down the table, while I placed my materials at the position of authority beside our CEO. As I organized my presentation notes, I caught Andrea Barnes whispering to her colleague, her expression now curious rather than dismissive. "Thank you all for returning for this detailed review." I began, my voice steady and authoritative. "Before we discuss specific contract terms, I want to ensure we have shared understanding of the financial framework for this partnership." I activated the main screen displaying our first slide, a comprehensive breakdown of manufacturing costs based on Westbrook's specifications. You'll notice these figures differ somewhat from yesterday's preliminary discussion. After careful review, I've updated all projections to reflect our actual production costs, verified against historical data from similar manufacturing runs. Jeremy shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. Thomas Williams leaned forward, comparing the screen to documents before him. "These unit costs are 19% higher than what was presented yesterday," he noted, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes. Yesterday's numbers reflected theoretical best-case scenarios rather than actual sustainable production costs. I maintained direct eye contact, offering transparency rather than apology. Today's figures represent costs we can confidently commit to in a binding contract." Scott Peterson Westbrook's CFO studied the breakdown intently. "What accounts for the most significant variances?" I advanced to the next slide, showing component sourcing costs. 3 primary factors. First, actual vendor contracts for specialized components at guaranteed volume levels. I highlighted the relevant sections. Second, realistic labor projections including specialized engineering oversight. Third, quality control processes necessary for components at this specification level. For the next 20 minutes, I methodically presented accurate financial projections, addressing questions with precise data rather than vague reassurances. When technical specifications arose, I deferred appropriately to Frank, who supported the revised timelines and quality measures. Jeremy remained uncharacteristically silent until I reached the production timeline slide. "These manufacturing milestones add 4 weeks to the schedule we discussed previously." He finally interjected, his tone conveying professional concern, while his eyes flashed warning at me. "They reflect realistic production capabilities," I replied calmly. "I've verified these timelines with 3 shift supervisors and our production scheduling system." Jeremy's jaw tightened. "As VP of Operations, I can assure our partners at Westbrook that we can meet the more aggressive timeline I outlined yesterday. The moment had arrived. I could either back down or directly challenge his authority in front of both companies' leadership. I chose a third approach. Perhaps you could walk us through specifically how you plan to achieve that acceleration, Jeremy. Which processes would be modified from standard procedure? The question was professional, reasonable, and impossible for him to answer truthfully without revealing his previous misrepresentations. Various proprietary efficiency measures my team has developed, he replied vaguely. Could you share the documented results from previous implementations of these measures? I pressed gently, particularly for components in the same specification category. Thomas Williams intervened before Jeremy could respond. I appreciate enthusiasm for aggressive targets, but we prefer realistic commitments. Daniela, please continue with the timeline you verified. Jeremy's face flushed slightly as I returned to the presentation. The power dynamic had shifted palpably, his authority undermined, not by direct accusation, but by specific data he couldn't refute without admitting previous fabrications. As the presentation continued, Westbrook's team gradually relaxed their questions, evolving from skeptical challenges to constructive partnership discussions. When I reached the final financial slide, showing healthy, though not exaggerated profit margins, Scott Peterson nodded with professional respect. These projections align much more closely with our market research. I appreciate the transparent approach. The atmosphere shifted decisively when Andrea Barnes addressed me directly. Daniela, regarding the specialized engineering team you mentioned, could you elaborate on your retention strategies for these high-demand positions? That's been a challenge across the industry. The procurement director who had ignored me completely yesterday was now seeking my expertise specifically. I outlined our technical talent retention program, noting the industry-leading 91% retention rate for specialized engineers. Perhaps most importantly, I concluded these realistic financial projections ensure we won't face margin pressures that typically lead to corner cutting or staff reductions mid-project. Sustainability in both financial and workforce planning is our priority. Thomas Williams exchanged glances with his team, a silent communication passing among them. I think we've covered the critical financial aspects thoroughly. Could we take 10 minutes to confer privately? Of course, Margaret agreed. We'll step out and give you the room. As our team filed into the hallway, Jeremy positioned himself beside me, his voice low and tight. What the hell do you think you're doing? Presenting accurate financial data, I replied calmly. Something that should have happened yesterday. You've deliberately undermined me in front of a $300 million client. I've corrected misleading information before it created legal and financial liability for Pinnacle. I maintained professional composure despite his looming presence. The questions about your numbers were already there. I provided answers that restored their confidence. Margaret approached before he could respond further. Jeremy, could I speak with you privately? Her tone made it clear this wasn't optional. As they stepped away, Frank moved beside me. That was impressively handled. Factual without being accusatory. The facts speak for themselves, I replied. Thank you for backing up the technical assessments. The numbers make sense with the actual production requirements. He hesitated. I should have questioned some of those projections myself over the past year. Before I could respond, the conference room door opened. Andrea Barnes appeared, gesturing to Margaret. We're ready to continue. We returned to find the Westbrook team rearranged legal counsel, now positioned prominently beside their CEO. Thomas Williams addressed Margaret directly. We've reviewed the revised projections and timeline. While they differ from yesterday's preliminary figures, we find today's presentation more credible and aligned with our expectations. He turned to me. We would like to proceed with contract discussions based on the framework Daniela has presented. The validation sent a wave of relief through me, quickly followed by professional focus on next steps. Excellent, Margaret replied. We can move to specific terms immediately. Thomas hesitated. Actually, we'd prefer to work directly with Daniela's team on the financial structure before bringing in operational details. Perhaps we could continue with just your finance and legal representatives for the remainder of today. The implication was clear. Jeremy's presence was no longer desired in these negotiations. Margaret processed this diplomatic exclusion smoothly. Of course. Daniela will lead our team for the financial framework discussions. She turned to Jeremy. Perhaps you and Frank could prepare the technical specification reviews for tomorrow's session. Jeremy's expression remained professionally neutral, but the muscle pulsing in his jaw betrayed his fury. Certainly he managed gathering his materials with deliberate calm. As he and Frank departed, the atmosphere in the room noticeably relaxed. Scott Peterson moved to sit directly across from me. Now that we've established realistic baseline figures, let's discuss payment milestone structures. For the next 3 hours, I led Pinnacle's negotiating team through detailed financial terms, drawing on my Goldman experience to secure favorable conditions while maintaining the transparency that had rebuilt Westbrook's confidence. By late afternoon, we had established the framework for a contract both companies could execute successfully. As the meeting concluded, Thomas Williams shook my hand firmly. I look forward to working with you throughout this partnership, Daniela. Your approach today salvaged what could have been a problematic relationship. After the Westbrook team departed, Margaret remained in the conference room with me as others filed out. You did exactly what needed to be done, she said once we were alone. The board chair has requested a full briefing on the financial discrepancies tomorrow. Will Jeremy be present? He's been placed on administrative leave pending review. Margaret's expression was complicated relief mixed with disappointment. His office is being secured as we speak. The magnitude of what had transpired finally registered fully. In 24 hours, I had transformed from dismissed HR executive to acting CFO, who had secured a 9-figure contract and initiated the downfall of a powerful, manipulative VP. What happens next? I asked. Margaret considered me thoughtfully. That depends partly on you. Richard's retirement was already planned. We now have an acting CFO who performed extraordinarily under pressure. The implication hung in the air between us, a potential permanent transition from HR to the financial leadership of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I'll need time to consider that, I replied honestly. Margaret nodded. Take the evening to process. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. She gathered her things, pausing at the door. By the way, still just in HR, makes a rather impressive CFO. Alone in the conference room where corporate history had been rewritten, I allowed myself a moment of personal satisfaction. The journey from dismissed to decisive had taken exactly 24 hours. Jeremy's face when I walked in as acting CFO had indeed been worth every moment of underestimation. But the victory wasn't about personal vindication. It was about standing for accuracy, transparency, and integrity when easier paths were available. Tomorrow would bring board inquiries, possible legal ramifications for Jeremy's actions, and decisions about my own professional future. For tonight, I had one simple task. Call Allison and tell her we'd secured the contract based on honest numbers and realistic commitments. The corporate chess game had reached check, though not yet checkmate. The morning after our confrontation with Westbrook arrived with unexpected sunshine breaking through Seattle's typical cloud cover. The meteorological shift seemed appropriate for the dramatic changes unfolding at Pinnacle Industries. I arrived early, having slept surprisingly well despite the previous day's intensity. The security guard's greeting contained new respect. "Good morning, Miss Harrison," rather than the usual "Morning, Daniela." News traveled fast in corporate environments. Allison waited at my office door, coffee in hand, an expression uncharacteristically excited. "The contract is signed," she announced without preamble. Westbrook's legal team worked overnight. $302 million, with the first milestone payment already processed. "That was fast," I remarked, unlocking my door. Apparently they had another vendor ready, if we couldn't provide acceptable terms. Once you corrected the financial framework, they wanted to lock it down immediately. She followed me inside. "Also, Margaret wants to see you at 9. Her assistant said, and I quote, "Before the board meeting, not about the board meeting." I checked my watch, 7:30. That gives me 90 minutes to prepare for whatever's coming next. Already handled. Allison placed a folder on my desk. Complete documentation of all financial discrepancies identified in operations over the past 18 months. Supporting evidence for each instance. Timeline of escalation attempts by various departments. And testimonials from 3 financial analysts who raised concerns to Jeremy and were subsequently reassigned. I stared at her in amazement. How did you compile all this overnight? I didn't. I've been building this file for 7 months. She smiled slightly at my surprised expression. I worked in operations before HR. Witnessed the beginning of the pattern. When you started documenting irregularities, I realized someone with authority might finally address it. This revelation shifted my understanding of the past 6 months. You've been preparing for this confrontation all along. Preparing for someone to stand up to him, yes. I hoped it might be you. Allison's typically professional demeanor softened. People underestimate HR executives at their peril. At 9 precisely, I knocked on Margaret's office door folder tucked under my arm. Come in, Daniela. Margaret sat behind her desk looking simultaneously exhausted and energized. Please close the door. I complied, taking the offered seat across from her. The board meeting at 10 will address the Jeremy situation formally, she began. Before that occurs, I wanted to discuss your role going forward. I assume I'll return to HR once this situation stabilizes, I replied. That's one option. Margaret leaned forward. The other is a permanent appointment as Chief Financial Officer. Though this possibility had been implied yesterday, hearing it stated explicitly sent a jolt through me. That's a significant shift. 1. You're qualified for, as yesterday demonstrated conclusively. Your financial background, combined with your understanding of organizational dynamics, offers a perspective our executive team critically needs. She paused. Richard has agreed to extend his transition period to train you if you accept. What about HR leadership? The cultural transformation we've begun is still fragile. You could oversee both departments temporarily while we search for your replacement in HR, or you could recommend an internal promotion. Margaret smiled slightly. Though finding someone with your particular combination of skills won't be easy. I need to consider carefully before deciding, I said. This wasn't what I envisioned when I joined Pinnacle. Take the day. The board will want your testimony regardless of your decision about the role. She glanced at her watch. They're gathering now in the main boardroom. Jeremy has been summoned with his attorney. The implications of this statement weren't lost on me. This had escalated beyond internal corporate discipline to potential legal consequences. Will criminal charges be filed? I asked directly. That depends on what the forensic accounting team discovers during their comprehensive audit. At minimum, we're looking at serious securities violations if his misrepresentations affected our public financial statements. I nodded, absorbing the gravity of the situation. I'll provide whatever information helps establish the truth. Margaret studied me for a moment. You know, when I recruited you to transform our company culture, I never anticipated you'd begin by exposing financial manipulation at the executive level. But perhaps that's exactly where cultural transformation needed to start. The board meeting lasted 4 grueling hours. 14 directors, Pinnacle's general counsel, outside attorneys, and forensic accountants filled the boardroom. Jeremy arrived with his lawyer, his usual confidence, notably diminished. I presented the evidence methodically, without embellishment or accusation. The numbers told their own damning story. Systematic manipulation of operational costs, misrepresentation of vendor, contracts efficiency metrics, manufactured to trigger performance bonuses. Jeremy's defense that he had used aspirational targets rather than concrete figures crumbled when confronted with emails showing he had directly instructed financial analysts to adjust reports for board presentations. By meeting's end, the board had unanimously voted to terminate his employment and cooperate fully with any subsequent regulatory investigation. As security escorted Jeremy from the building that afternoon, I watched from my office window, feeling no satisfaction in his downfall. The victory wasn't seeing someone else fail. It was in standing for integrity, even when doing so carried professional risk. The following weeks brought whirlwind changes to Pinnacle Industries. A company-wide audit revealed the full extent of Jeremy's manipulations, nearly $28 million in misrepresented costs over 2 years. The SEC opened an inquiry. 3 of Jeremy's direct reports resigned, rather than face investigation. Through it all, I maintained dual roles, continuing HR leadership while working closely with Richard to assume CFO responsibilities. The decision had come more easily than expected. Finance had always been my foundation. Adding human understanding to financial leadership offered a unique opportunity to transform corporate practices from the inside. Westbrook proved to be the ideal first client under this new leadership approach. Their weekly progress meetings included not just production metrics but also workforce sustainability measures. When I presented our first quarterly review, showing numbers exactly aligned with projections, Thomas Williams remarked that consistency and transparency build stronger partnerships than optimistic promises. Within Pinnacle, the cultural shift happened gradually, then suddenly. Frank Chen, once Jeremy's ally, became a vocal advocate for cross-departmental transparency. Financial analysts who had feared reporting accurate numbers now received recognition for identifying potential issues early. The board instituted new whistleblower protections and anonymous reporting channels. Margaret and I established monthly open forums where employees could question executive decisions directly. Attendance grew from a skeptical few dozen to hundreds participating in person and virtually. Trust once broken began the slow process of rebuilding. 3 months after the confrontation, Richard officially retired with a company-wide celebration of his 30-year career. At the reception, he pulled me aside. "I worried about leaving Pinnacle after watching what happened under my watch," he confessed. "I should have pushed harder when I first noticed the discrepancies." "You raised concerns through proper channels," I reminded him. "The system itself needed changing." "Which is exactly why you're the right person for this role." He smiled. "The board made it official this morning, by the way. Unanimous vote for your permanent appointment." The news spread quickly. By afternoon, my inbox overflowed with congratulations from colleagues throughout the company. Most meaningful was a handwritten note from a financial analyst who had been sidelined after questioning Jeremy's numbers. "Thank you for making accuracy more important than authority." Perhaps most surprising was Jeremy's eventual resignation from the narrative he had constructed. Facing potential criminal charges, he accepted a plea agreement that included full cooperation with investigators. His statement to the board acknowledged prioritizing perceived success over factual reporting, though he stopped short of a complete admission of fraudulent intent. The press eventually caught wind of the story. Business journals published articles with titles like "From HR to CFO, How One Executive Stand for Transparency Saved a $302M Deal." I declined most interview requests, uncomfortable with being portrayed as a corporate hero for simply doing what should be expected, presenting accurate information. 6 months after that fateful Westbrook lunch, I sat in my new CFO office reviewing first quarter results. Pinnacle's financial health had stabilized. The Westbrook contract was proceeding on schedule and on budget. Employee satisfaction scores had risen 27%, while turnover had decreased dramatically. A knock at my door revealed Andrea Barnes from Westbrook in town for our regular review meeting. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Of course." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Our meeting isn't until 3. "This isn't about the contract." Andrea settled into the chair, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology. When Jeremy introduced you as still just in HR at that lunch, I completely dismissed you. I'm embarrassed by how quickly I accepted his framing." The acknowledgement touched me more than expected. We all make judgments based on limited information. Yes, but as a woman who's fought for recognition in a male-dominated industry, I should have known better. She shook her head. "Watching you walk into that conference room as CFO the next day was a powerful reminder not to accept other people's limitations of someone's capabilities." "That moment meant a lot to me too," I admitted. Though it wasn't just about the title, it was about finally being in position to ensure accurate information guided our decisions. Well, your accuracy saved both our companies from a potentially disastrous partnership built on false premises. Andrea stood to leave. See you at 3 for the official review. Though I already know the numbers will match exactly what you projected. As she departed, I reflected on the journey from that humiliating lunch to today. The transformation hadn't just been in my job title, but in the company's entire approach to financial reporting and employee value. Pinnacle now recognized that integrity in numbers and respect for people weren't separate corporate values. They were inseparable foundations for sustainable success. The true victory wasn't exposing one executive's manipulation. It was creating systems where accuracy was valued over ego, where expertise was recognized regardless of department, and where doing the right thing wasn't extraordinary, it was expected. 1 year after the day Jeremy introduced me as still just in HR, I found myself addressing 300 business students at my alma mater, Harvard Business School. The invitation had come from a professor who had read about Pinnacle's transformation in Harvard Business Review, from financial manipulation to transparent leadership, a case study in corporate integrity. Standing at the podium, I surveyed the ambitious faces before me, men and women who would soon enter the corporate world with their own values and choices to make. My journey from HR executive to CFO wasn't planned, I began. It resulted from a simple commitment to accuracy and respect. Those two values may sound elementary, but in many corporate environments, they require extraordinary courage to maintain. For the next hour, I shared the unvarnished story of that pivotal week at Pinnacle. The humiliation of being dismissed, despite my qualifications. The discovery of financial manipulations. The decision to stand for transparency, even at personal professional risk. And finally, the unexpected opportunity to transform a company's approach to both finance and people. The healing process after years of being undervalued doesn't happen overnight, I explained. For months after becoming CFO, I battled imposter syndrome, despite having literally written the company's financial restructuring plan. Old wounds from being dismissed and underestimated didn't magically disappear with a new title. I described the gradual process of rebuilding my professional confidence, aided by supportive colleagues and tangible results that validated my approach. The weekly meditation practice that helped process lingering anger. The executive coach who helped navigate the transition from advocate to authority figure. The most important lesson wasn't about finance or even corporate politics, I continued. It was about the power of believing in your own worth, regardless of others' perceptions. When Jeremy snickered about me being still just in HR, he revealed his own limitations, not mine. My qualifications and capabilities existed independently of his recognition. This realization had fundamentally changed how I approached leadership. In my dual role overseeing finance and temporarily guiding HR, I instituted practices specifically designed to recognize talent regardless of title or department. Cross-functional project teams now included members from throughout the company, ensuring diverse perspectives informed major decisions. When I finally stood up for accuracy and transparency, something unexpected happened. Others found courage to do the same. I shared how financial analysts who had once silently adjusted numbers to match executives' expectations now confidently presented actual data, knowing their honesty was valued above comfortable fictions. Perhaps most significantly, Pinnacle established a formal mentorship program for women in finance and technical roles, addressing the systemic barriers that had initially pushed me from finance to HR. 37 women had already completed the program, with many receiving promotions or expanded responsibilities. The company culture shift extended far beyond financial reporting practices, I explained. We rebuilt our reputation with employees by demonstrating that integrity mattered at every level. Anonymous satisfaction surveys revealed a dramatic change in perception from "executives don't want to hear bad news" to "this company values truth over comfortable fiction." This internal transformation paralleled our external rehabilitation. Industry partners who had grown wary of Pinnacle's optimistic projections now valued our reputation for realistic commitments consistently fulfilled. The Westbrook contract, now successfully past its midpoint, had opened doors to similar partnerships based on transparent financial terms. My personal growth through this journey required balancing assertion with compassion, I admitted to the students. While exposing financial manipulation was necessary, I took no pleasure in Jeremy's downfall. Understanding the pressures that drive unethical decisions helps prevent creating environments where others make similar choices. This perspective had led to unexpected reconciliations within Pinnacle's leadership. Executives who had initially viewed me with suspicion, assuming I sought personal advancement through Jeremy's disgrace, gradually became allies in building a more transparent corporate culture. Frank Chen, once Jeremy's staunchest defender, now led initiatives combining technical innovation with financial responsibility. The industry recognition for our approach came as a surprise, I continued. When the Wall Street Journal profiled Pinnacle's transformation, I realized our experience offered a counter-narrative to the notion that corporate success requires aggressive number manipulation. The article had triggered invitations to speak at industry conferences, opportunities to consult with other companies, implementing transparency initiatives, and eventually a nomination for Financial Executives International's Integrity in Leadership Award. However, I cautioned the students, external validation matters far less than internal conviction. True leadership comes from integrity, not titles or accolades. This truth had crystallized during my most recent meeting with Westbrook's team. Thomas Williams, who had nearly canceled their contract due to Jeremy's manipulated projections, now treated me as a trusted partner rather than just a vendor representative. The relationship had evolved from suspicion to collaboration, based entirely on consistent honesty rather than impressive promises. As I concluded my presentation, I shared the reflection that had become my personal leadership philosophy. Your value isn't determined by others' perception. Your qualifications don't disappear when someone fails to recognize them. And your integrity matters most precisely when upholding it carries personal risk. The students' response, a standing ovation, felt less like personal validation and more like affirmation that these principles resonated with the next generation of business leaders. During the reception afterward, a young woman approached hesitantly. "Your story really affected me," she said quietly. "I'm concentrating in finance, but considering switching to HR because I keep getting overlooked in my internships, despite having the highest analytical scores." Her situation mirrored my own early career crossroads. "Both paths have value," I told her. "But don't leave finance because others fail to see your capabilities. Sometimes standing your ground changes not just your future, but the environment itself." As I flew back to Seattle that evening, I reflected on how completely my professional life had transformed in a single year. From dismissed HR executive to respected CFO, from struggling against a toxic culture to helping reshape it, from swallowing humiliation to standing firmly for truth. The greatest lesson wasn't about corporate strategy or financial practices. It was about the courage to reinvent yourself when necessary, while maintaining unwavering commitment to core values. Jeremy's dismissive introduction, still just in HR, had unwittingly launched a transformation that benefited not just my career, but an entire company's approach to both people and numbers. Tomorrow, I would return to my CFO responsibilities at Pinnacle. The Westbrook contract would require reviewing production milestone achievements. The mentorship program needed evaluation for its second cohort. The board expected quarterly projections reflecting both accuracy and ambition. But tonight, flying above the clouds, I allowed myself to appreciate the journey that had brought me here. From dismissed to decisive, from undervalued to essential, from silenced to leading the conversation about corporate integrity. The true measure of success wasn't the title on my door or even the company's improved financial performance. It was creating an environment where others could bring their full capabilities without diminishment or dismissal, where accuracy mattered more than ego, where still just in HR could never again be used to minimize someone's contribution. Have you ever been underestimated in your workplace? What did you do about it? Share your story in the comments below. And if you found value in how I turned my moment of humiliation into professional triumph, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about navigating corporate challenges with integrity. Remember, sometimes the person who dismisses you today might be watching you lead tomorrow. Thanks for listening, and may your own professional journey be filled with the courage to stand in your truth.